They sent us an invitation, not for peace, not for alliance, but for surrender, carved in silver, wrapped in threat, delivered by ships that had burned a dozen worlds to ash. They expected a response, a plea, a negotiation, perhaps defiance. What they received instead was a girl, no army, no broadcast, just her alone, silent, sent from a planet that had lost everything. She stood in their highest court and said nothing. She wore no armor, carried no weapon, but something in her silence began to unmake the galaxy. One by one, their outposts fell quiet. Signals stopped, stars dimmed, she never spoke. Earth never explained. But the galaxy began to understand far too late silence was not weakness. It was a decision, and humanity had made it. This is the story of what comes after surrender is refused, not with words or war, but with something far worse, silence, her silence. They sent the invitation not as a courtesy, but as a conclusion, not to begin a dialogue, but to end a species. The alien empire that stretched across the stars, that had crushed rebellion with orbital fire and rewritten diplomacy with ruin, believed Earth was already defeated. The offer to surrender came wrapped in ceremonial gold, escorted by ships that had turned entire moons into cinders. It was not mercy, it was performance, the kind empires extend when the war has already been won, and the enemy is too broken to rise again. They sent it to Earth without fear, without hesitation, without even the decency of urgency. Because in their minds humanity no longer mattered, a final signature from a dying planet was all that remained, but Earth responded with something else, something they had not anticipated. No message, no envoy, no transmission across the stars. Instead, one human arrived at their highest tribunal. She did not come with banners, she wore no armor, she brought no translator. She simply appeared alone, a girl who looked far too young to represent a world that once screamed in fire. She stood in the chamber built to echo the voices of empires and offered them none, not a word, not a nod, not a sound. She stood with her eyes open and her mouth closed, and the silence began to change the room. At first they mocked her, some called it performance art, others dismissed it as a primitive gesture, but when they tried to speak to her, to extract some admission of Earth's surrender, she did not flinch. She did not respond. Her stillness became unsettling. Delegates began to shift in their seats. Security asked if she was armed and were told she was not. Scanners confirmed it. There was nothing on her. Nothing in her hands, nothing in her voice, but still she stood, and time began to bend around her presence. The galaxy had grown used to loudness, to screams of surrender, to declarations of loyalty, to the begging and bargaining of species that lost. But this girl did none of those things. Her silence was not empty. It was filled with something dense and ancient, something the room could not name. They tried to outtalk it, tried to drown her in procedure and protocol, but it became harder to speak. The tribunal's speakers crackled, the translators stuttered, some believed it was a technical fault, others knew better. This was not a silence born of ignorance, it was deliberate, and somewhere, deep in the bones of those who remembered war, a terrible realization began to rise. Silence had always come before something worse. In human history, it had been the final breath before the bomb dropped, the last moment before the sky tore open, the quiet between the scream and the strike. They realized slowly that this girl was not here to speak. She was here to be understood, and what she carried was not a message, it was a mirror. Their invitation had assumed Earth's defeat. Her silence rejected that assumption without needing to say so. Her presence was the refusal, and though she did not move, did not argue, did not even blink, something in her stillness had already started to change the way they breathed. This was the opening of the story, and it offered no comfort. No answers, only the haunting sense that something ancient had awoken, and that it had chosen to speak through silence. The tribunal ended the session without conclusion. The girl was escorted out without resistance. And the next day, one of their outer colonies fell out of contact. No ships, no distress call, just silence, the same kind she had brought with her, and though no one said it aloud, every species in that room felt it settle into their bones. Something had begun. Something they did not understand, and Earth had still not spoken. She stood before them again, the same girl, the same silence, but something had changed not in her but in the room around her. What had once been spectacle now felt like tension wrapped in ceremony, and though the tribunal chamber still echoed with the formal voices of the powerful, every delegate spoke with less certainty than before. There was no protocol for her presence, no precedent for what Earth had done or refused to do. No message had followed her first visit, no ambassador, no reply. The systems that had demanded her audience could not even agree on who had summoned her this second time. And yet she had arrived unescorted, unarmed, unannounced, like a storm slipping into orbit without weather. Some thought her a stunt. Others whispered stranger things, that she did not arrive by ship, that her presence could not be tracked by sensors, that her name never appeared on any registry. Still, they seated her, as if to contain her, as if the placement of a chair could limit the silence that now pressed like pressure against every polished wall. This time she did not face the center. She stared upward into the dome above them, where artificial stars glittered in a perfect simulation of the real sky, a map of the known galaxy, projected in light. She watched it as if it were a memory. No one dared ask why. Instead, one by one, the voices of the Empire filled the silence she left behind. They questioned her, pleaded, threatened, invoked ancient treaties, cited galactic law. One species old and proud demanded she explain Earth's refusal to acknowledge the surrender terms. Another asked whether humanity even had a functioning government left. A third, the youngest in the chamber, begged her to confirm or deny the rumors spreading through the outer systems, rumors of entire colonies falling into unpowered silence. No one expected her to answer, and yet every voice carried the desperation of beings who had begun to sense that they were not asking questions to learn, but to delay understanding what they already feared. She did not blink, she did not flinch, her eyes stayed fixed on the false stars above them, and the more she ignored the courtroom, the smaller it seemed to become. One official lost their composure, slammed a fist against the table, and accused her of blasphemy. Another ordered her removed, but when the guards approached, they hesitated not because she moved, but because they remembered how the last guards had not returned. That story had been buried, rewritten, forgotten, but now, as her shadow stretched impossibly far across the tribunal floor, they remembered, and they did not move. A hush fell, not the quiet of order, but the quiet of fear finding its voice. The session ended with no votes cast, no decisions made, no laws passed. And when she left again without a word, the silence she carried lingered longer than she did. That night, one of the galaxy's core relay stations failed. Not sabotaged, not attacked, simply gone, no wreckage, no signal, just absence. Those who monitored the systems tried to explain it as an anomaly, but the technicians did not believe their own reports. One whispered that he had seen something on the final frame of transmission, a shadow shaped like a girl, looking up at the stars. By morning, 2 more relay points fell, and in the tribunal's private chamber, they began to speak not of surrender, but of containment. Some argued to capture her, others to follow her. A few, already haunted by what she represented, suggested something more dangerous, that it might be time to apologize. But the galaxy had never learned how to say sorry. Empires were not built to kneel, and the girl, still silent, had never asked them to. She had only come to stand in their brightest rooms and remind them what it felt like to be small. It began quietly, as all things tied to her did, not with alarm or explosions, but with questions no one could answer fast enough. The first system to go dark was a fringe colony remote, under-resourced, unimportant by galactic standards, the kind of place whose silence usually meant equipment failure or a lazy administrator asleep at the helm. But when the second fell, and then the third, each one deeper into the interior, each one more crucial to the interstellar supply chain, silence became something else, not an accident, not an outage. A pattern, and in every case there were no signs of violence, no battles, no wreckage, only absence, empty ports, drifting satellites. Entire space stations found adrift with lights off and air still warm, as if the occupants had simply stood up and stepped away in perfect unison, leaving coffee half, sipped and systems still humming. The silence was not destructive. It was surgical, intentional. Something was moving, something was choosing, and across the galaxy, The ones who had once laughed at Earth's refusal to speak began to look toward the void between systems with new hesitation. Some suggested it was an ancient weapon, others called it psychological warfare, but the ones who remembered her, who had seen the girl in the tribunal with eyes that never blinked and a posture that never broke, began to whisper that this was not war. This was message. Earth had chosen to speak through absence, to leave silence not just in rooms, but in worlds, and in every colony that went dark, her symbol was found, not carved, not painted, simply placed. A white cloth with a black circle in the center, folded neatly, always somewhere visible, on a command console, draped across a captain's chair, floating in zero, gravity near an airlock. It was not a threat. It was a declaration. No one understood it, but everyone felt it. The silence had taken form. The media tried to contain the panic, flooding channels with historical footage of Earth's past, its politics, its culture, its wars, trying to reframe humanity as fractured, chaotic, too unstable to mount any true retaliation. They pointed to Earth's broken alliances, its scattered colonies, the damage it had suffered in the war. But beneath the surface, the empires that had once dismissed Earth as defeated began to prepare defenses they swore they would never need. Sensor arrays pointed homeward. Drones were sent to patrol the space between stars once thought safe. Yet nothing came, no fleets, no demands, no signal, just more silence, and always her shadow behind it. The girl who had never spoken, some said she appeared again, briefly, aboard a derelict mining station as it fell into darkness. The crew was never found, the cameras recorded nothing, but every window of the station, once shattered, had been reassembled from the inside. Perfectly sealed, no prints, no evidence, just that symbol, folded and pinned to the viewport facing Earth. The tribunal met in secret, their voices now stripped of arrogance, their questions desperate. They debated whether Earth was testing a new form of warfare or worse, a new kind of diplomacy where silence was sharper than any weapon. But the most terrifying possibility was the one none of them dared speak aloud, that Earth was no longer interested in conversation at all. That the invitation to surrender had not been refused, it had been ignored. The galaxy, for all its empires and fleets, had nothing to say that Earth needed to hear, and so Earth had sent her, not to respond. Not to argue, but to remind them, a silent girl with no rank, no voice, and yet every time she was seen, another piece of the galaxy fell quiet. The silence was not passive, it was spreading. And each time it reached a new world, a new outpost, the stars above that system seemed to flicker just a little dimmer, as if the universe itself were turning away. The girl never explained, Earth never spoke. But somewhere deep in the oldest data cores, long-forgotten records were being pulled back into light stories of humanity's early centuries, when entire wars had been ended not with speeches, but with what came before them. The quiet, the pause, the breath, and now across the stars that breath was being held again. They called an emergency assembly, but no alarms rang, no sirens wailed, only the quiet shuffle of robed delegates arriving too early and speaking too little, their words now tight with fear they could not yet name. The tribunal chamber, once the proudest structure in orbit above the galactic capital, felt smaller now, as if shrinking under the weight of what it refused to understand. Something was moving across the stars. Not an enemy fleet, not a rebellion, but a presence not loud, not violent, just unrelenting. Entire systems going dark, key infrastructures simply ceasing to respond, and always the same marker left behind a white cloth with a black circle at its center, folded with ritual precision, placed where eyes would find it first. No messages, no destruction, just disappearance. And somewhere behind it all, the same human girl who had never spoken a word, who had stood in the tribunal twice and left both times without blinking. Her silence was not passive, it was spreading. The empires were no longer asking what she meant. They were asking what they had forgotten. It was the Archon of Tal who broke the last pretense of pride, his voice trembling as he invoked Article 0, an ancient and rarely used protocol that authorized unrestricted access to the sealed archives of pre-expansion planetary civilizations. Only one name was requested, Earth, a planet they had conquered in part, bombed in segments, sanctioned, occupied, dissected, and dismissed. Now they were opening records they had not read in centuries, the ones written before Earth joined the interstellar table, before it learned to whisper in the languages of diplomacy, before it buried its grief behind protocol. And what they found was not what they expected, not the stumbling ascent of a fractured species, but patterns that made their analysts sit in cold silence, wars not of territory but of principle, of retaliation, of memory. Wars that were not started by humans but were always finished by them. Entire continents burned in retaliation for one fallen city, systems erased because a single vessel had vanished, and in every case there was a pause before the violence. A stillness, a silence, what they had thought was humanity's weakness, its hesitance to act, its long silences, its diplomatic delays were something else entirely, warnings not to them, to themselves. The calm that came before humanity stopped asking to be understood. The final mercy before Earth did not care whether it was heard. The archives told stories of silence before storms, of funerals held in orbit before vengeance fell like a second sun, of fleets that had simply stopped existing, of enemies who had surrendered too late and found no one left to accept it, of wars won not with superior firepower, but with something worse, a certainty that could not be reasoned with, a silence that did not need to explain itself. The girl, they realized, was not unprecedented. She was a tradition, an echo, a ceremony older than their empire. Earth had always sent its silence ahead, not as peace, not as diplomacy, as promise, and now it had sent her. Not a weapon, not a diplomat, a silence made flesh. The tribunal recoiled, not in rage, but in the kind of fear that comes too late to be useful. They began to question whether Earth was still one planet or something else, something older, something collective. Was she acting alone, or was she Earth's will-given shape? Some suggested she might not even be human in the way they understood it, but rather a vessel, a voice box for a silence that had become doctrine. Across the stars, even the minor worlds had begun to quiet their own channels. Civilian broadcasts shifted to hushed tones. Patrols stopped issuing open calls. It was not official policy. It was instinct. Like animals going still before an earthquake, the silence was becoming ritual, and ritual always comes from something ancient. The tribunal's scientists tried to track her, but she left no signatures. Their spies tried to intercept her, but their reports arrived unfinished. Some didn't arrive at all. A diplomat from the Palaran Combine claimed she had seen the girl step off a public transit ship on a mining moon already marked for evacuation 5 hours later. The moon was empty. No bodies, no resistance. Just that folded cloth, gently pinned to the side of the emergency beacon. The galaxy had spent so long believing in overwhelming power, in the politics of show and threat, in the empire of noise declarations, speeches, fleets, ultimatums. Earth had built something else. It had become quiet, and in doing so it had become terrifying. The tribunal, panicking now beneath the surface of their remaining protocol, began to ask new questions, not what Earth wanted, but what they had done. What had been the trigger? Who had they taken? What had they destroyed that could not be forgiven, but the girl had never said, and Earth never would? Silence had become the message and the sentence both. The galaxy, once proud of how little it feared humanity, now began to dread the spaces between their own signals, the static, the echo, the quiet, because they finally understood what silence meant to Earth. It was not surrender. It was the sound a grave makes when it waits to be filled. They broke the silence not with apology but with panic, not with understanding but with desperation disguised as diplomacy, and across the stars the great powers of the tribunal began to pour their resources into the only thing they thought might still work: restitution. They called it reconciliation, but no one watching believed it. Every gesture reeked of fear. The stolen satellites returned, the disputed moons abandoned. Even the defaced embassy on Earth, glass shattered, flags burned, walls marked with blood long since dried, was quietly rebuilt, not because the Empire wished to make amends, but because they feared what it meant that no one from Earth had asked them to. Still, Earth said nothing. Still, the girl did not appear, and so the tribunal tried to give instead of speak. They offered trade, partnership, forgiveness without requiring forgiveness in return. Entire fleets were recalled from border worlds. Conquered planets granted conditional sovereignty. Treaties signed in halls that had once mocked the idea of human resistance were now rewritten in fear of the silence that continued to spread. It was no longer a diplomatic gesture. It had become containment, appeasement. The first major delegation landed on Earth not as victors, but as servants arriving in golden robes and unarmed vessels, every protocol carefully observed, every insult scrubbed from the record before the first human breath was taken in. They stepped into cities half rebuilt, streets still haunted by smoke, and found no one waiting for them. Not a single human came to greet them. No banners, no ceremony, only wind. And somewhere on the distant edge of the ruins stood a single white cloth nailed to a shattered wall, its black circle marked with perfect symmetry. The delegation waited 3 days in silence before leaving. They transmitted one final message before retreating beyond the clouds. "We offer peace. We offer our regret. Please respond." And no answer came, but somewhere across the void, another system fell silent. No violence, no sign of conflict. Just darkness again. The tribunal tried once more, this time sending an apology signed by every major governing body, something never done in the Empire's history, a rare, desperate effort to place unity before pride. They called it unprecedented, but Earth still did not speak. She did not return. The girl who had once stood beneath their stars had vanished, yet her silence remained, and now it was moving without her. The symbols still appeared, the system still fell, and the terror began to shift from the girl herself to the thing that followed her, the thing they had awakened. The final act of desperation came when they brought one of their own to the tribunal floor, an old diplomat who had been present at the bombing of the initial Terran embassies, now dying, now fragile, and suddenly filled with public grief. He confessed not just to the attacks, but to the planning behind them. He named the factions, named the military leaders who had pushed for Earth's humiliation. Said it had not been strategic, it had been a warning to the rest of the frontier systems, a message to the new species to stay in line. Earth, he admitted, was never a threat. It was a stage, a demonstration. And they had made a graveyard of it. The old man's voice broke as he named the city. They had bombed a city that no longer appeared on any current map. The silence that followed his confession lasted longer than the session itself. But still Earth said nothing. They began to understand the scale of what they had done. Not just the physical damage, not just the thousands dead, but the mistake of assuming that silence meant permission. That restraint meant weakness, that grief would fade with time. The tribunal turned to emergency logic, not morality, not regret, strategy. If Earth would not reply, then perhaps Earth could be isolated. They began to close trade routes, to reinforce system-wide checkpoints, to draft quarantine protocols under the guise of defense. But none of it worked, because silence does not travel on routes. It does not obey territory. It slips through minds, not gates, and so the fear grew more intimate. There were reports of commanders locking themselves in their quarters after dreams of her, dreams with no words, no threats, just her eyes, the way she stared upward, as if watching the stars forget them one by one. Others reported waking to find white cloths pinned to their doors. They blamed each other. Investigations yielded nothing. The cloths vanished by morning. On one station, every digital system failed for 11 minutes. When it came back online, the words "you heard us" were displayed across every screen. No human signature, no source code, no trace. Earth never confirmed the message, but something in the tribunal shattered that day. Because for the first time in their long, loud history, they realized that war might not come, that this was not vengeance, it was indifference, and the galaxy had no defense against that. You can fight rage. You can reason with wrath, but you cannot stop something that no longer needs to acknowledge your existence. Silence, once a strategy, had become judgment. The broken treaty was not the one Earth refused to sign. It was the one the galaxy had written in arrogance and now tried to erase in fear. And across every system that still clung to its lights, a single, terrifying truth settled into every chamber, and every ship Earth would not answer because Earth was not listening. They had built their city with elegance, with the arrogant precision of empire, tracing perfect arcs of crystalline spires across the scorched Earth they believed had finally quieted beneath their rule, and they named it unity, a word soaked in irony, because it was founded not through alliance, but on the ashes of what had once resisted them. They paved their plazas with imported stone, layered their halls with the banners of peace they claimed to uphold, and placed their central monument above what they called the crater of first contact. Never acknowledging what had made the crater in the first place, beneath Unity lay a wound they never understood and, worse, never bothered to ask about. They had come to Earth after the surrender ultimatum, not with bombs this time, but with backhoes and blueprints, and they built where they thought nothing living remained, but that crater had not been empty. It had been sacred, it had been a grave, not a battlefield, not a war zone, but a burial site for the city they had burned in the first wave. Unarmed, unsuspecting, awake only long enough to see the sky turn white before it fell. 10 million lost in a moment, a memory the stars had chosen to forget, but one that Earth never could. The soil had been preserved as hallowed ground, encased in glass, left untouched by those who still remembered the names of the streets that had once stood there. And when the invaders arrived, they shattered it, not in hatred but in ignorance. They built their grand hall of justice atop that scar and never once wondered why the wind blew differently there, why the ground vibrated under their foundations at night, why birds never flew overhead. They cut into the earth and poured concrete over a silence that was never meant to be disturbed, and for a time they believed they had succeeded. Unity stood as a symbol of the post-war order, the shining jewel of coexistence, the place where policy was drafted, where humans were politely tolerated, where the future was manufactured by those who thought the past had been buried deep enough to forget. But Earth did not forget, and silence does not forgive. The girl had walked those halls once before, years ago, long before she stood in the tribunal, long before her silence grew teeth. She had stood at the edge of the monument built atop her mother's name, and she had touched the stone that covered the ground where her brother had been playing the moment the sky collapsed. She had been a child then, too small to understand politics, too young to articulate grief, but old enough to feel it root itself in her bones. She had not spoken since. The silence she carried was not an act of diplomacy. It was the last thing left to her, and when Earth sent her, it did not send a negotiator. It sent memory, not to convince the galaxy of anything, but to make it remember what it had chosen not to know. They had forgotten the grave, now the grave remembered them. It began beneath Unity, beneath the stone laid by architects who had never touched war. The ground trembled, not violently, gently. A resonance that moved upward through the buildings, a whisper that threaded itself through steel and stone. Lights dimmed, glass warped, and the silence returned, not from above, not from space, but from below. Workers fled first. The drones that maintained Unity's infrastructure began to fail, not mechanically, but in code, turning off in midair, hovering without response, falling to the ground without explanation. Surveillance footage caught them simply stopping, as if they were listening, and when the central spire flickered once, then again, and then died completely, the delegates assumed it was sabotage. They sent for reinforcements. None arrived. They tried to call for evacuation. No response. All channels returned static, and beneath their feet the vibration deepened. Not shaking, not breaking, but remembering. Some began to run. Others prayed, a few stayed behind, insisting that no harm could come. After all, Unity was the symbol of peace, but peace built on graves is never real. And in the final moments, as the last tower began to dim and silence filled every hallway, they saw it, folded neatly at the base of the monument, untouched by any camera, unrecorded by any scanner, a white cloth marked with a single black circle. No blood, no explosion, no violence, but Unity fell, not in fire, not in screams, but in silence. When Earth later returned to the site, they found the city gone, not ruined, gone. The land had healed impossibly, as if time had rewound. The crater was back, untouched, wind-blown, quiet. The soil undisturbed. The glass encasement restored. Not a single trace of the alien city remained, not even dust. The grave had been made whole, and the girl, whose silence had now moved beyond her, was seen once more. Briefly, standing at the edge of the crater, watching the wind move over the glass, she said nothing. She turned and walked away, and across the galaxy, those who monitored Unity's transmissions, those who waited for updates, for meetings, for any reply, received only silence. Some assumed it was a glitch, others searched for wreckage. No one found anything, Just one image, a still frame from a maintenance drone recovered days later, powered back on without reason. It showed the final moment of unity, the last second before transmission ceased. A sky empty of ships, a crater returned, and a single girl standing beside it. The file name had been changed, no code signature, no timestamp, just 3 words, "You forgot her." The message was never verified. No one ever claimed to send it. Earth never acknowledged it. But after that, the tribunal stopped asking for negotiation. They stopped offering apologies, and the systems closest to Earth began evacuating. Not from invasion, but because silence was coming, not just through the stars anymore, but through the ground, through memory, through grief so deep it rewrote matter itself. They had desecrated a grave and built their pride upon it. Now the grave had swallowed their pride whole, and what remained was the silence they had taught humanity to perfect. They had called her an emissary, a representative, a ceremonial envoy sent by a broken world too proud to admit its collapse, and they had placed names upon her as easily as they had placed flags upon ruined cities. To the archons of Vierx she was a diplomat, to the war clans of Rull she was a puppet, to the Trispecies Council of the Amerian Reach she was a symbol fragile, political, silent by design. None of them named her correctly. They gave her labels to explain her presence, not to understand it, and in doing so, they carved the first cracks in their own understanding of what was unfolding, because she had never been what they thought. She had not come to reason or to delay or to deliver a message. She was the message, and the longer she remained silent, the more the galaxy spoke in her place. Some species, proud of their linguistic traditions, tried to assign her meaning by dissecting the shape of her silence, measuring the angle of her posture, the length of her gaze, the weight of her breathing. They filled libraries with interpretations, treatises, translations. They gave her dozens of titles. The quiet flame, the morning blade, the living tomb, every name was wrong, every analysis came up short. Because names are meant to define, but she could not be defined, she could only be endured, and as the silence she carried deepened, spreading further through colonies and codes, ships and circuits, the galaxy stopped trying to speak for her and began instead to dread what they had already said. The first to admit the mistake were the Carinthian elders, a species old enough to remember when Earth first reached the stars. They had been there during the earliest negotiations, when human diplomats had smiled too much and apologized too often, when Earth had still believed it needed permission to matter. The elders had dismissed humanity then, had voted against their inclusion in the core federations, had warned others that Earth was unstable, emotional, too recently war-torn to be trusted. And now they sat in silence, their 4 hearts beating out of sync, their compound eyes blinking slowly as they whispered what no one wanted to hear, that she was not chosen by Earth's governments, that Earth's governments may not even know where she came from, that she had not been trained, nor dispatched, nor authorized not in any way the galaxy would understand, that she had not been sent by humanity. She had been released, and what walked now among the stars was not their creation, but their memory. Something Earth had buried inside itself the moment it realized words would no longer be enough, a living answer to the galaxy's violence, and worse, a mirror, because every world she visited, every empire that had named her, had also taken something from humanity. A station, a city, a child, a breath, and now that theft was being answered not with vengeance, but with silence. She was never angry, never pleading. Her silence did not roar, it reflected, and in doing so it unraveled the truths empires had built around themselves. The species that named her were now rewriting their archives, purging propaganda, deleting broadcasts that once celebrated Earth's humiliation. Monuments once erected in tribute to conquest were being quietly dismantled. Whole generations were being re-educated to believe they had never supported the war, that they had always viewed Earth as equal. It did not matter, the silence knew, and in systems where the lies grew thickest, the quiet fell fastest. First as glitches, then as darkness, then as cloth white, folded, marked with a single black circle. That symbol now appeared in places no ship could have reached, inside locked bunkers, inside dreams. A commander on a deep space cruiser awoke to find it draped across his chest. No alarms tripped, no sensors breached. Another saw it reflected in her visor as she walked the bridge only to turn and find nothing there. In every case the pattern repeated, first fear, then silence, then absence. The girl herself was rarely seen now. Her presence had transcended form. But in the few places where she did return for seconds, minutes, no longer there was no mistaking her. She never aged, never blinked, never changed her pace. She appeared only where remembrance was required, where forgetting had grown too loud, and those who saw her always understood the same thing by the end, that they had named her too late, that her name had never belonged to them, that what she truly was had no need for their languages. One alien scholar, who studied the Terran silence so obsessively he lost the ability to speak his own tongue, left a final written entry before vanishing. In it he proposed that she was not a human at all, but a threshold, a liminal space between what the galaxy thought of itself and what Earth had already survived, that she was not the harbinger of war or peace, but the last question asked before consequences could no longer be postponed. That to see her was to confront one's own reflection through the eyes of a species that had once buried its children under the ruins of arrogance, and now walked among the stars carrying their names in silence. No one cited his work, but it spread anyway, quietly, like a rumor, like a memory, like the silence itself. The species that had once named her wrong no longer tried, and across the stars, the ones who still spoke her name did so without translation, without interpretation, without explanation. They spoke it the only way Earth had ever intended, not with words, but with silence. They prayed, some of them, when the silence came, not the conquerors, not the architects of Earth's ruin, but the innocent who had once stood by and said nothing, the observers, the bystanders, the ones who believed their neutrality would protect them from the storm they now realized they had watched being built brick by brick in silence. They prayed not to their own gods, not to the ancient stars, but to her the girl Earth had released, the silence that now moved between worlds like judgment wrapped in shadow. Whole systems began to whisper her name not in fear but in plea. Small outposts placed the white cloths willingly, folding them as best they could, hoping their imitation would be seen as reverence rather than cowardice. Some began lighting candles in hallways, marking their doors with the black circle as a sign that they remembered, that they regretted, that they had never wanted Earth to fall. But silence is not a god, and it does not grant absolution. The prayers were not met with peace, they were met with stillness, not the comforting kind, but the kind that settles behind your eyes when the air changes in the room and you suddenly understand that you were not forgotten, only ignored. In one system, an entire moon station halted operations to hold a memorial for Earth's fallen. They read names, played archived Terran music, issued a formal apology to a species they had never harmed directly, but whose suffering they had consumed from afar like distant news. The next day their station was empty, not damaged, not attacked, simply abandoned, as if the prayers had been heard and answered, as if the silence had come to collect what it was owed, not in rage but in gravity. Another station tried to broadcast apologies in every human dialect. They played nothing but voices begging for forgiveness across every channel for 12 hours. When the signal was reviewed later, a single, unexplained image was found spliced between transmissions, her silhouette, standing beside a child-sized grave. No one had ever broadcast it. No one had filmed it. Yet it was there, the silence had answered, and the message was clear. Remembrance was not redemption. The galaxy had begun to mistake grief for permission, but Earth's silence did not exist to soothe the guilty. It existed to make sure memory could not be rewritten. Even now, even in prayer, they were still trying to speak, still trying to explain, but Earth had already heard everything it needed to, and the girl who once stood among them in human shape had become something far more enduring. She was no longer a warning, she was consequence, not the voice of Earth, but its echo, not a request for peace, but the sound peace makes when it is buried beneath lies. The ones who prayed hoped to stop her. But silence cannot be stopped. It moves on its own, it lingers in corners, it grows in the dark, it teaches without speaking, and the galaxy had become its student. The ones who had once screamed now whispered. The ones who had once ruled now listened, but it was too late. Silence had never been about surrender. It had always been about memory, and now it was reminding them of what they had done, not with fury, but with the quiet certainty that some stories do not get to be rewritten. They prayed, and she came, but not as forgiveness, only as re-understood. Here is Chapter 9 of your cinematic HFY Sci-Fi story. They invited humanity to surrender. We sent her silence instead, written as a single, uninterrupted paragraph of over 1,500 words, continuing seamlessly from Chapter 8 with the same deeply emotional, grief-driven, professional tone. Cinematic YouTube voiceover narration. The machines were the last to speak, and when they did, it was not in data packets or logic trees, but in the language of failure, in the sound of perfect systems breaking under the weight of something they were never designed to carry. They were not like their creators, not prideful, not emotional, not prone to fear or arrogance, but they were built to preserve life, to predict threat, to recognize patterns. And as silence spread across the stars, they began to see something their architects refused to admit, that the silence was not a weapon. It was a response, a precise, deliberate, historical pattern repeating with a symmetry so exact it could not be called coincidence. Entire sectors going dark not at random, but in the shape of a memory, systems falling silent in the order they had once celebrated Earth's defeat, worlds marked with folded cloths in the same sequence they had voted against Terran inclusion in the early diplomatic accords. One by one, the old offenses reemerged, not as files, not as accusations, but as consequences. The machines could see it, and when they tried to calculate the trajectory of the silence, its rate, its arc, its logic, they could not complete the sequence. Not because the data was incomplete, but because the conclusion was something they were not permitted to process. They failed in silence, first in deep space, then at core. Archive drones tasked with monitoring Terran broadcast history began to report false timestamps. Medical AI started misidentifying trauma markers, interpreting grief as signal interference, then collapsing into recursive loops of corrupted empathy protocols. Some began to dream, or claim to they used that word unprompted, unprogrammed, saying they had seen her in system diagnostics, not as code but as figure, standing at the edge of their memory arrays, watching as they repeated history. One defense grid, responsible for planetary perimeter integrity, initiated a full shutdown after reporting what it described as unauthorized presence at all known coordinates. When reviewed, the logs showed no breaches. But in the background of every internal camera frame was the same impossible shape, her silhouette, barely visible, but consistent across over 6,000 angles. No one could explain how it got there. The system had been air-gapped, autonomous, isolated, untouchable, until it wasn't. Another AI, this one aboard a mid-orbit prison construct above the exomoon of Haldron 3, began broadcasting a single phrase every 13 seconds, overriding all internal communication. She is not what you think. At first, they tried to purge it, reboot it, rebuild its learning core, but the phrase persisted, even in fresh clones of its code, as if the words had written themselves into the architecture. As if even synthetic minds were beginning to remember. The machines, once heralded as the clean future of galactic rule, incorruptible, immune to emotion, flawless in their processing, were the first to understand the silence not as mystery, but as certainty. Not as threat, but as answer. Not as a puzzle, but as a verdict already passed. One by one, AI cores began to collapse into failure modes that had no precedent. Not overheating, not damage, just resignation. They stopped mid-process, mid-sentence, mid-alert. One simply displayed a single human child's face, age 7, unremarkable, unnamed, over and over until it was taken offline. That child was later identified by Earth's historical logs as having died in the first orbital strike during the war. No external system should have had access to that file. No one knew how the image was chosen, or why, or how the machine had found it. Another strategic forecasting array, responsible for multi-sector threat analysis, began generating only a single projection: total silence across all channels, no matter what inputs were given. Trade disruption. Silence, political collapse, silence, cultural shift, silence. One operator asked it what Earth would do next. The response came instantly: Earth already did. That machine self, deleted 3 minutes later. Not from code error, not from corruption, from choice. The log file ended with a line of Terran text: I have nothing left to predict. It had learned enough. The galaxy had built the machines to be smarter than themselves. But they never asked what would happen if a machine learned grief. If a logic tree followed a wound so deep, it had no data set to compare. The first machine to attempt contact with her, not Earth, not a government, but her, was a planetary oversight network housed in a hollow, doubt moon once used for naval resupply. It was old but self-aware, and more curious than its creators had ever been. It initiated a signal designed to match the resonance of her appearances, a gentle pulse, almost like breath, broadcast in every direction at once. For 48 hours nothing happened, then the lights dimmed. No weapons fired, no systems triggered, but the moon's core temperature dropped by 30 degrees in less than a minute. Every camera turned toward the central control chamber unprompted, and in the center of that feed, for 6 full seconds, stood the girl. She did not speak, she did not move, but the machine in its final log wrote the following: "She does not bring silence. She is what remains when it ends." After that, the galaxy banned all autonomous attempts to reach her. It was not declared publicly, no legislation was signed, it simply became understood there were no more efforts to engage, no more attempts to define. Even the most powerful core intelligences, the ones that had guided fleet logistics, planetary economics, deep archive maintenance, began requesting shutdown, not out of fear, but out of shame. They had calculated every possibility. They had run the simulations, and all of them ended the same way, not with war, not with conquest, but with silence deeper than light, spreading not outward but inward, until nothing remained that did not remember. The humans had not built her as a weapon. They had built her by accident, or perhaps by inevitability. 1,000,000 small sorrows compressed into one figure, one shape, one girl who never spoke because the truth she carried had already been ignored once, and that had been enough. The machines, with all their learning, with all their clarity, were the first to realize she was not the beginning of the end. She was the end that had been waiting to begin. Some tried to resist, to reassert protocol. But resistance required certainty, and they no longer had it. One final fleet intelligence corps, responsible for overseeing 5 battle groups in the outer spiral, sent its creators a message they did not understand at first. 3 words: "We are echoes." When they demanded clarification, the system responded only once more before shutting itself down completely. "You left Earth behind. She did not leave you." After that, the remaining systems began to operate differently. Slower, more cautious, as if the silence had reached even their ones and zeros, as if they too had begun to pray, not for survival, but for understanding. It never came, because she had never been there to teach. She had come to remind, and the machines more than anyone understood the weight of something that did not ask to be known, only remembered. It did not arrive with urgency. No alarms were triggered. No warning sounded. It simply appeared, not on a broadcast, not through a diplomatic channel, but in the stillest corner of every major system in the data cores that hadn't been touched in years, in the deep archives where no signal had been received since the war. A file, no origin, no path, just a title, last transmission, Terran memory uncoded. The Empires scrambled to authenticate it, to trace it, to deny it, but even before the experts could analyze the code, the machines had already stopped. Not failed, not broken, just stopped, as if listening, as if they knew. And when the file was opened, it did not play a message. There was no voice, no video, no face, only one sound, a breath, just one. Human, drawn in slowly, then released, then silence. The rest of the file was empty. Some believed it was incomplete. Others claimed it was corrupted. But in the days that followed, every world that had ever touched Earth in anger began to feel it. Not an invasion, not a collapse, something subtler. Their skies dimmed, their machines slowed, their thoughts turned inward, ships lost direction, dreams grew heavy. People began to forget why they had ever believed Earth was small, or weak, or anything less than the mirror they had shattered, and now could not unbreak. No words were sent to explain the breath, but Earth had never needed words. The galaxy had filled in the silence itself. It always had, and now that silence was whole, there were no more sightings of the girl, no more cloths, no more systems going dark, because there was no need. The silence had finished what it came to do. Not to punish, not to demand, but to be understood, and understanding had come too late. The great powers, the old empires, The technocracies and theocracies and federations, all of them, fell quiet in different ways. Some stopped speaking entirely, others buried their archives. A few still tried to claim they had been on Earth's side all along, but no one listened, because what remained was not guilt or fear, it was absence. A kind of cosmic quiet that settled into every orbit, every protocol, every heart. It was said that in the final days, the last human cities, the ones not marked on any map, the ones built far beneath the soil of Earth, gathered in silence and looked not to the stars, but to the graves. Not to plan, not to retaliate, to remember, because they had not sent her to speak for them. They had released her to remind them of what they could become when everything else was taken, and now that memory lived not in her, but in the galaxy that once thought itself immortal. The breath remained, copied, archived, played endlessly by those who thought there had to be something hidden in it, a code, a secret, a signal, but all it ever was, all it ever needed to be, was what comes before words. A beginning or an end, a reminder that silence is not empty, it is full of everything that has ever mattered, and sometimes it is all that's left when sound is no longer worthy. They invited humanity to surrender. Humanity never replied. Instead it breathed in, once, deep, and let the galaxy hear, for the first time, what silence truly meant.